Thank you very much for those welcoming remarks. And I feel a little bit awkward that now that drinks and dinner have been mentioned, because I fear there may be rumblings in the tumbling, as Winnie the Pooh used to say. But I hope edification in a more philosophical sense can be offered before dinner. So first I want to offer my thanks for this invitation. It's an honor to be asked to speak here. And on this issue, it's that the conference is under the auspices of the philosophy department, I do think is worth noting. That philosophy might or should open up to metaxological community with Christianity and not just be in flight from it, or silent about it, or indifferent or hostile to it, or in revolt against it, is worthy of note. It is fitting that the event is taking place at St. Patrick's, Maynooth, for some centuries now identified with the official institution of the Catholic Church in Ireland. There is much history in this place, much of it forgotten, but some of which might be briefly recalled. Maynooth is a place of betweening, between religions, between versions of Christianity, between Ireland and England, between Ireland, England and the continent. It was set up at a time when those who wished to study for the Catholic priesthood mostly had to do so on the continent. Now, some Irish people will know all of this, of course, but some Irish people will not know this too, and people from abroad may find it interesting. To study on the continent in Irish colleges and elsewhere. The Irish College in Louvain was set up at the beginning of the 17th century in that space. Whatever the motives were for allowing Maynooth College to be set up at the time that it was, one of the things worth recalling is the complexity of Ireland's betweening, both with respect to British and continental relations. The Irish Catholics were forced to go abroad, but abroad they sometimes picked up ideas that, being brought home, disturbed the attempted settlement on the island itself. The college was set up at a time of revolutionary activity in France and Europe generally, washing over also significant groups here in Ireland itself. An aspect of the setting up of Maynooth was as an effort to offer a house of studies at home where the danger of infection from continental pestilences might be guarded against. There is a Burke room in the house which greets you as you come in, though all of the other rooms are named after notable bishops. I have not been put in the Burke room, to my great disappointment. But Burke's engagement with Ireland and through his son at the time is full of significance for relations with the Irish neighbours, mainland and continental. I recall the religious and political turbulences not simply to revisit or reopen old wounds, but to think of Maynooth as a place of betweening, a place of crossing, perhaps agonistic, perhaps sometimes filial, sometimes antagonistic, between religions and politics, between us, the continent, and Britain. It is ironical that in the time after it's being set up, it itself became an establishment looked down on with a certain critical irritation by those who saw it as catering to lower levels of religious intelligence on the part of a more peasant Irish population. From my own life and experience, I do recall among commentators a kind of exasperation at the hindrances to Ireland's entry into the progressive advances of enlightened modernity. My suspicion is that this attitude has not changed a lot. Perhaps I should worry the less, given the fact that a conference like this is taking place here, a betweening of international dimensions with scholars and thinkers of plural orientations and none void of intellectual heft in thinking about the relation of philosophy and theology. This is a hopeful testament to Maynooth as a meeting place, a place of possible companionship, not only between some persons in Ireland, but also between those and eminent scholars and academics from around the world. I stress this because there are times when one thinks that what Ireland sorely lacks is precisely a between, a metaxu or middle space where the issues of religion generally and Christianity particularly can in fact be explored in a spirit of open investigation. Here in Ireland, religion is often treated as something that for centuries held the Irish in thrall, held the Irish back. Back from what? But to such an extent that all our pious predecessors should be seen as either knaves or fools or slaves. For those of us who are Irish and of my generation, this would mean that one's grandparents, one's parents, one's uncles, aunts, cousins, extended family were all somewhat robotical in relation to De Valera and Archbishop McQuaid. Now, the funny thing is that when I typed Eamon De Valera, my spell checker changed it into Devil's Arrows. Even my cybernetic program on the computer is woke. I hope I exaggerate, but when I read some of the Irish commentary, I fear that I understate the darkness that has now descended on discussions of such matters. But this is not just an Irish story. It's a story to be found in the unfolding of the project of modernity itself. It has to do with a long process of neutralizing, if not exterminating, the signs of divine communication in given creation. I've written about this elsewhere, so it suffices to say that in the long history of Christianity, the neutralizing of signs of the divine, amounting to the de-sacralization of given being, can end in the neutering, putting out of play, of the divine itself as the giver of signs. One might justify this de-sacralization as a movement against idolatrous elevations of given being into divine status. But there can be de-sacralizations in the name of and in elevation of the human being into the privileged and perhaps only placeholder of divine presence. And this perhaps with long-term temptations to make itself not simply a sign of divine presence, but the original of divinity itself. From the war on idols, we can become the maker of idols. The de-sacralization I am referring to has been concentrated into a very short period of time in Ireland, while on the scale of the Western world, particularly in terms of its European expression, this unfolding has extended over a number of centuries. Ireland is very striking in that respect. Perhaps since around the 60s and over the succeeding decades, something has been taking place that in other parts of the Western European world has extended over centuries. One of the results is that one has Christians like me who grew up in another world which was, in its own way, saturated with signs of the divine, and we now live in a cybernetic wasteland devoid of signs of the divine, but saturated with idols. I stress this question while granting that there are de-sacralizations that can serve a purified sense of divinity beyond the idols. The question is whether we ourselves, as destroyers of idols, become creators of idols, creators of ourselves as the only remaining part of divinity. Then the project of de-sacralization, we're not far from endorsing the project of enlightenment insinuated by the serpent in the garden. You too shall become as gods. With all due qualification, we are in the business not only of endorsing the serpent, but of trying to prove that the serpent had it right. So again, a somber beginning, if you like, but I do think that it has much to do with the relationship between philosophy and Christianity. One might see Christianity, in fact, as not the de-sacralization of creation, but as its new consecration. Christian consecration can be met with the same animus against divine signs as we find in some putatively secular desacralization, desacralizing. How do we distinguish deconsecration from desacralization, and this from desecration? And all of these from an original and new consecration. So this is one of the worries that I have, that deconsecration sometimes is only a few steps away from turning into a kind of desecration of sorts. And I understand, I intend that, of course, from an ontological point of view, where the very goodness of being itself as communicating something of the divine is erased. We might distinguish de-sacralization and desecration and also de-Christianization, though the intimate connection of all three does call for reflection. We can only dechristen what once was Christian or named as Christian. The process of de-Christianization can take many forms, and it would be an exploration in itself to ask how differently it might be proceeding in Ireland as opposed to, say, France after the French Revolution, or in the US after the still continuing upheavals of the 1960s. We often now live through winds that began to blow in that time and that we have inherited. To be de-Christianized in a passive sense means one simply falls away. One has lost the taste for it, as Nietzsche put it. When Father Tom was talking about Heaney yesterday, it taking place off stage. Something happens and the taste for it. But why does the salt lose its taste? And what is there to savour food with when that salt has lost its taste? Or one might actively dechristen in that one overtly renounces being named as Christian. One no longer wants to be the bearer of one's Christian name, or any such name, if one has once been christened. Or if one has never been christened, one will perhaps avoid anything but traces of those old names. I think that some philosophers have been agents of the first de-Christianization, and that there are philosophers who would be agents of the second. So in the remaining parts of the paper, I have a section on companioning. I have a section which is called Christ-haunted philosophers, and just a final section then called Christening philosophy. So companioning. There are different relations possible between philosophy and Christianity, and I propose this companioning relationship between them. But there is a pre-Christianity to philosophy. But I find we live in the wake of a de-Christianizing which flows from an insistence on a certain freedom of philosophy understood in terms of its power to determine thought immanently through itself alone. Now again, this whole issue of freedom, I think, is a plurivocal issue. Autonomy should not be univocally identified with the essence of freedom. Autonomy can be understood to be one particular form of freedom, but freedom takes many forms, and there are forms not just of being free, but also forms of being freed. And that brings us into relation to what frees us to be ourselves, and not just simply ourselves as freeing ourselves. But I would stress again the word between, but further qualified this as a matter of betweening. So in recent writings, the transformation of between, the between, seems like a noun, naming a space, so to say, an ontological space. But betweening is more a verb, a wording, rather than just an adverb or a preposition, or indeed a noun. Wording is a relating, verbing is a relating, enunciating relation. Adverb or proposition might be seen as qualifying a relating. Noun might be stressed as naming that wherein relating or the modality of relating happens or is enacted. The companioning relation is a betweening. And remember that the word between comes from roots in Old English, betwonum, and there's some guests here from both Belgium and Holland. Twee, by two, the two-ness, but by two by two, is present as companions saunter together by two, as disciples are sent out on mission to the world by two as a companioning, a being in community, by two keeping company. Of course, there is bad company, as there are good friends. There are counterfeit doubles of companionable betweening, and that's a question also to just ask at this point. So I think, again, in relation to philosophy and religion/theology, we can see the two as thresholding on each other. The notion of a threshold, again, is in one sense a line. I'm not quite sure that's the martial arts holding the intersectional middle line that we had this morning, but that is a threshold also, of course, on which one tries to find the balance that is optimal in defense or assault upon one's opponent. Different betweenings are possible on the threshold. Think of, again, companioning as a betweening. The companions can turn towards each other, they can turn away from each other, they can touch each other, they can pass together over the threshold. One might carry the other over the threshold, as in practice of marriage of old. There are many ways of turning towards and turning away. De-christening philosophy and what I call default atheism enact different ways of turning and turning away. What then of the touching and being touched on the threshold? In some ways of looking at things, there is no threshold. That there is a threshold of betweening, I would like to defend. But this is not to deny differences. Even given differences on the threshold, the companions can be held together by the difference and in the difference. So again, I just have a little bit of a survey to a certain extent to indicate that there's a plurality to the way the relationship between philosophy and religion has been understood throughout its long tradition. And I think that, again, that's one of the most important aspects of philosophy in the continental tradition, again, very broadly understood, is that a sense of a long conversation extending back to Greek philosophy is not just merely a supplement or an addendum on the outside of the project itself, but enters constitutively into the nature of the conversation. There's philosophy before Christianity. I refer widely to the widely accepted view that philosophical logos emerges from religious mythos and indeed perhaps rationally supersedes it. By contrast, this is what I'm saying, the companion doesn't emerge from its other and then supersede it, as laying out in conceptual articulateness what the first companion cannot quite say truly or truly enough. This is not the most helpful way of describing companioning. In truth, I would say that there was much more porosity between logos and mythos with the first emergence of philosophy. Excuse me. I am a citizen of the ecological disaster that is facing us, since this is an apocalyptic tone. But what I do to be the catacone in my small way is I print on two sides of the paper, but I am creating confusion for myself because I do that. I am benefiting the cosmos by printing my paper on two sides, but sometimes I turn over the paper and forget what page I'm on. So if I look confused, it's because I am confused. Further, one might recall classical figurations of reason and revelation, where philosophical reason is painted as natural, scriptural revelation as supernatural. The image is that of the theological queen and the philosophical ancilla, the sovereign ruler and the handmaid. Subordination is not perhaps the best word for companioning, though again in this instance there was permeability across the threshold between philosophy and theology. The permeability coming from this companioning was not always to the fore as a theme, asking mindfulness. One might give words to this permeability in terms of the secret porosity of thinking and praying. Etienne Gilson delicately offers a spousal metaphor of scholasticism. He calls it the honeymoon of theology. The honeymoon is well behind us in modernity, it seems to me. Modern philosophy rebelled against any ancillary role and sought to erect a postcard on the threshold, on the imminent side of which natural reason might perfect its own self-determination. I would say that in the companioning relation, one participant, no matter from which side, does not queen it over the ancillary contribution of the other. The relation of the sovereign and the servant is to a degree reversed in the modern definition of philosophy as essentially self-determining. No ancilla is self-determining in the full sense that is here claimed to be the rational desideratum. The servant who becomes the autonomous master overcomes the over-againstness of the two by now claiming a kind of mastery over the erstwhile master or mistress. The servant becomes master of the sovereign queen and stakes its claim to be beyond all ancillary functions. Once again, I cannot see this as a good account of companioning. There is a freedom of being between and being together beyond the dyadic opposition of autonomy and heteronomy. There are further variations, and perhaps, since there's time, I think of the rationalistic scholasticism where philosophy, first presented as propedeutic to theology, later becomes entrenched in almost an apartheid of the two, especially when philosophy feels it has the measure of all its others. Claiming to be the measure of its others can itself turn into a claim over against these others. Philosophical reason, no longer companioning, turns in some instances into the debunker of the religious. I'm thinking of Enlightenment reason, and that itself can mutate into the critique of the Kantian project and its descendant variations. The critical judge might write in a serpentine way, I'm thinking of Kant here, of the conflict of the faculties, but the straight message is hard to hide. The professor of philosophy is the king. Once again, this is not the companioning relation. I think of Hegel, and again, I apologize for bringing Hegel in. Some people claim I'm obsessed with Hegel, which probably is true, but there are reasons for that. So a philosopher would say something like that, and especially a philosopher who is a student of Hegel. One thinks of Hegel as claiming to complete the Kantian revolution in the speculative together of the religious representation and the philosophical concept. The professor of philosophy is now emperor in the kingdom of thought. What of the companioning? Where is it? The philosopher who sublates religion is more tempted by supersessionism than companionship. Perhaps even more, as the world spirit on horseback is not a companioning partner, neither is the world spirit in the philosophical study. I have some other remarks on Kierkegaard, who in a certain sense I think initiates a kind of a slave revolt of religion against the imperial sovereignty of speculative dialectic. I will pass over some remarks about some other thinkers. I'll come to the question of Nietzsche in a little while, very relevant to our topic. But I want to just note that in earlier thinkers in the philosophical tradition, the persisting traces of a proximity, indeed a kind of familial intimacy between the philosophical and the religious, was a source of real potential fertility for the very seriousness of philosophy itself. The intimacy, this intimacy was more a living option in the ethos of these thinkers. It may not necessarily always have been made an explicit object of thematic reflection. This is not quite true in our own time. If you like, pre-modern philosophy especially, they're rubbed against each other. This is even true, I think, into the 19th century. In our time, it's, I believe, not so true. Rubbing can incarnate a gesture of intimacy, become perhaps even a kind of caressing. I would say the intimacy can serve as a source of creativity in philosophy and perhaps also in theology. But to avoid rubbing against each other irritably, we may set the two apart into different silos, but then each suffers. Philosophy loses the urgency of ultimacy, religion decays into sentimental effusion or expires in moralistic platitude or mutates into the fury of a revolutionary dream of secular salvation. Perhaps that sense of rubbing together was covered according to the ontology of Thomistic being in the second speech this morning, so I don't need to dwell on that anymore. The section Christ-haunted philosophers. I mentioned there is a pre-Christianity to philosophy, and the earlier Christianizing of philosophy did find much in it allowing a Christian companioning, in Plato particularly for Augustine, in Aristotle, with qualifications for Aquinas, to mention two major figures. If one finds a de-Christianizing of philosophy in the longer arc of modern thought, I find it interesting to ask if post-Christian philosophy is itself Christ-haunted, if I might put it so. I am thinking about the enigma of Christ for philosophers generally, and then in modernity especially, with the self-assertion of autonomous thought. Its diminished and diminishing sense of the holy, and its and perhaps first its moralization of the holy, and then its subsequent progressive evacuation of the holy. It's also worth asking if this haunting also marks a threshold in which companioning can be renewed, a threshold on which too perhaps it can be rejected in a redoubled way. Again, I have a number of thinkers here, but I just thought I'd make a brief reference to Spinoza for, again, strategic reasons, and then perhaps spend a little bit more time talking about Nietzsche. One of the reasons why I would choose Spinoza is precisely because there is an ontology of immanence that is really first radically formulated in his sense of substance as what is to be defined in and through itself alone, the sense that there is one substance. And his rejection, for instance, of the theological doctrine of creation, because it's going to create two worlds, and there are not two worlds for him. Deo siva natura, the very word siva is itself redolent of a kind of equivocation. If God is nature or nature is God, this can be parsed in the direction of something that is reductive, certainly of the traditional sense of the transcendent creator, or it can be seen as elevating nature into the status of something more exemplary of a pantheistic whole. I find it actually very revealing that initially Spinoza was, so to say, Spinoza maledictus, the most infamous atheist of his age, because he was interpreted simply as a step away from atheism. And then towards the end of the 18th century, with the Romantic generation, Novalis and others, he became, as I would put it, instead of Spinoza maledictus, he becomes Spinoza benedictus. He becomes the God-intoxicated man. And the fact that these two radically opposed interpretations are possible, or at least have been generated by Spinoza, I think is interesting. But it's interesting also that he does grant a kind of exemplary status to Christ. There's an interest and an admiration on Spinoza's part with Christ, even as a kind of philosopher. But I would say this, that his take on religion is that in the end what he says there has to do with what can be said ad captum vulgi, so to say. Religion is for the many. It appeals to the imagination, whereas the true philosopher ascends to a proper form of rational knowledge, and the images that are in the popular sense of religion are in a certain sense transcended. They're not just simply rejected, to be sure, but nevertheless there's clearly a hierarchy of ultimacy. The Enlightenment moralization of the holy and the de-sacralization of Christ are initially kind enough to give Christ the consolation prize of moral exemplarity. The Christ haunting has not quite reached the pitch of Nietzsche's Antichrist, but it is not without significance that Nietzsche, one senses almost to his surprise, late came to appreciate Spinoza as a blood brother. The companionship of Spinoza and this Antichrist might not have been endorsed by Spinoza himself. But I think it's worth reflecting on a changing of the philosophical hagiography between Christ and Spinoza in a contemporary enthusiast of Nietzsche. And this is the thing that struck me in reading something in Deleuze, who is extremely popular, particularly among many students doing MAs and PhDs and so on. Deleuze refers to Spinoza as the Christ of the philosophers. And my suggestion is that Deleuze himself allows himself to be haunted by Christ in praising Spinoza as exemplary for the philosophers of immanence. It would be interesting further to reflect on Nietzsche's own self-appellation as Antichrist, And yet striking is his signing one of his last letters with the names of the crucified as well as Dionysus. The risen Christ passed through doors, but the post-Christian Christ seems to have the power to pass between opposites, porous to the name of the enemy, being all names and no name, a ghost impossible to confine behind the closed doors of self-completing philosophy. If Spinoza is the Christ of the philosophers, surely this is a compliment to Christ as much as to Spinoza. Compliment in that the high nobility of Christ is called upon and ascribed to Spinoza. And perhaps haunting the hinterlands of the ascription is the holy innocence of solitary suffering in communion with the ultimate. The mirror in which Spinoza is praised is haunted by the image of Christ. Christ haunts Deleuze, so to say, at one remove. Being post-Christian, it perhaps is the case that no escape from Christ is finally offered. Again, I have some remarks here which I will just summarize. It's very interesting to look at what Kant says about Christ in his later writings, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. The one I particularly want to refer to is where Christ is exemplary. And again, you see, this is a praise of Christ. No one exemplified the moral law as purely as Christ did. But he is a Vorbild. He's an exemplar. He is not the Urbild. He's not the paradigm, so to say. The Urbild is something that each of us as rational beings carry within in ourselves. And in Kant's way of looking at Christ also, because he's a historical individual, he's marked by the contingency of an empirical historical instance. He doesn't have the rationalistic necessity of the Urbild, which each of us carries. So in one sense, there's an admiration and a complementary reference, but it's certainly being displaced into a different space than would be understood within, say, the Christian understanding itself. Hegel, as a young man, actually was very much taken with Kant's ethics. He claimed to complete the Kantian revolution and go beyond it, but he even tried his hand at that genre of comic literature that became very popular after Kant, where Jesus is a Kantian on the mountain, translating the Beatitudes into the terms of the categorical imperative. There was a veritable rush to offer one's Kantianization of Christ in that particular time. Christ is very important for Hegel, but in the end he is not so far from Kant insofar as Christ reveals the death of God, but the death of God is not singularized in this absolute way in Christ simplicitur. There's a medial transition to what he sees as the community of spirit, and Hegel himself has a certain irritation, as I read him, with Christians who fixate on the singular figure of Christ. One of those who fixates, so to say, in that respect would be Kierkegaard. The very singularity, the absolute singularity of Christ is set against the supersessionism of the speculative dialectic. But there's much to be said on that, which I have to put to the side on this particular occasion. I want to say something about Nietzsche to round off this particular section of my reflections. The book that was published after Nietzsche died, his autobiography, strange autobiography, singular in its own astonishing way, Ecce Homo, behold the man. And of course, these are the words of Pilate, his declaration to the crowd as he shows Christ to them, offering them the opportunity to choose him or choose Barabbas. Pilate's declaration on showing the innocent Christ to the crowd, the sacrificial victim. I find it deeply thought-provoking, if not disturbing, that Nietzsche took the title Ecce Homo for his autobiography, placed next to the title of his most violent attack on Christianity, the Antichrist, Ecce Homo, Ecce, referring to himself makes one wonder who or what is being shown by Nietzsche, and to whom. Is Nietzsche showing himself as Pilate or as Christ, offering himself to the gaze and possible execration of the crowd, a sacrifice that will divinize the victim? Divine power, priest and sacrificial in one, a kind of counterfeit double of Christ. What else is the Antichrist? So Nietzsche, I think, is Christ-haunted, a seemingly odd thing to say given his assumption of the name Antichrist towards the end of his sanity. Quite to the contrary, there's nothing to be surprised about here. To assume the name Antichrist indicates one cannot define through oneself alone what one purports to be. One is what one is through negation of what one does not want to be. But what one does not want to be haunts one as a ghost that cannot be interred. Or rather, it is interred in the very negation itself, and from the grave in the spirit can be resurrected again. He has this phrase, the Roman Caesar with the soul of Christ, as his name for the successor to Christ in his economy of the spirit, which will define the tablets of value for the next 2 millennia. It's a strangely, Roman Caesar with the soul of Christ, a strangely tortured expression, ostensibly announcing a new superiority to Christ, in fact, dependent, in my view, on a misunderstanding or malformation of what it would transcend. The threshold is there and the possibility of a kind of companioning, but on that threshold, the attitude that ruled Nietzsche's agonistic spirit was secret envy. Christ the companion is Christ the competitor. The agon becomes a distorted mimesis out of which I believe counterfeit doubles of agapeic generosity were birthed. I think Zarathustra's gift-giving virtue is a counterfeit double of agapeic generosity. That's a study unto itself. Similarly, the child of Zarathustra is a counterfeit doubling of the child of Jesus. There is no father of Nietzsche's Zarathustra's child. It is a self-rolling wheel, and hence its yes is always a circling around itself, a sacred self-circling. It mirrors eternal recurrence, the cosmic circle that closes the porosity of the cosmos to creating divine transcendence, always more than any whole or absolute circle. Nietzsche wanted not to be Christ-haunted, but his exorcism of Christ only served to reinstate the inescapability of Christ. Dionysus versus the crucified. This is how he spoke again towards the end of his sane life. And he states an issue to be faced. There are redeeming nuances he does not state and cannot state given the lack of consciousness of the promise of companioning. Nietzsche has a view of the friend, again in Zarathustra, that has about it something odd, and there are enough signs in it to indicate that there are hindrances to companioning on Nietzschean terms alone. Nietzsche gloried in the claim, I am not a man, I am dynamite. There's a book just recently appeared last year with that title, but a lot of the commentators now don't realize that that was originally a comment made by a reviewer about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not a man, he is dynamite, and he didn't intend it as a compliment. But Nietzsche took it as a kind of brand. Brand is the right word insofar as the sense of fire is present in it. I am not a man, I am dynamite. A strange form of companioning that glories in blowing itself up, and indeed in destroying neighbouring others in its own suicide bombing. I mean, for instance, if you're walking out with a girl trying to court her and you say to her, I'm not a man, I am dynamite, she would say, I'm going to get a safety vest and, called a bomb squad. But when the explosion or implosion did occur, what were the names that came out to sign the event? Dionysus and the crucified. The implosion, the identity of indiscernibles in terms of the spiritual saving of the soul, Nietzsche names himself, christens himself as all names and no name, like the plurinomial divinity that yet signs itself in time with the singular name of Christ. We can no longer differentiate Antichrist and Christ. Sheer equivocity returns to undifferentiated univocity. Pages. I've stuff about Heidegger here, but Cyril is the wise man. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. So coming to my last section, christening philosophy. So what might christening philosophy mean in the light of some of these considerations? I mentioned how secularizing thought can lead to desacralizing, which in turn can lead to both deconsecration and perhaps even desecrating thought. What of the possibilities of consecrated thought? I would suggest that the vocational character of thinking is crucial. The vocational is not simply the professional. We might say, we do not think, rather thought comes to us, and our best thoughts come to us from who knows where. We find ourselves already on a way we do not first determine, from who knows where to who knows where, and that rather determines us to adventure further along the way. The quest to address mystery emerges itself out of mystery and never entirely dissolves the companioning mystery. Obviously, being consecrated to thought is not the project of a manager scholar. Projection might try to overtake consecration, management counterfeit vocation, but there is infidelity to the call of thought in this. Consecration is not something one can get a grant for, though in another sense, consecration is essentially in the business of being granted to itself. And if true to the given granting itself, it grants the call of a fidelity to what is granted. 18, 19. I myself have spoken of metaxological metaphysics as entailing a second birth of thinking in the dimension of what I call the hyperbolic, of the overdeterminacy of being, the too muchness of being, beyond the indeterminate, the determinate, and the self-determining, and pointing hyperbolically in the between to the God of the between, beyond the between. A second birth. I have done so diversely. There is the first birth in agapeic astonishment, and there is possible the resurrection of astonishment and perplexity, even at the limit of determinate cognition tending towards comprehensiveness. I think, for instance, you could know everything determinate scientifically about the universe, and yet the sense of mystery that's at stake here would not be dissolved. That answering that kind of determinate curiosity is not the death of curiosity, in fact, but brings us to threshold where the originating sense of astonishment is resurrected, but in a dimension that can't be answered for in terms of determinate knowing itself. In this regard, I would compare metaxology with a form of metanoetics. After all, the word meta, and again, metaphysics is in the doghouse for quite a long time, but meta itself has a certain double possibility built into it. It can refer to what is both in the midst as well as what is above, over and beyond. Too many see meta as a mere referral to a beyond invoked facilely. This itself is too facile. I can't avoid the temptation of stopping with the meta. The Zuckerberg, a savior. I saw a photograph the other day in the cinema somewhere, and you had a crowd of people with these black masks on them. Creatures from who knows where, no face, just black masks, meta people, but striding down the side stepways was almost like a savior figure, Zuckerberg, with a beaming face, a human face. And I said, come on. Imagine if all of you had your meta masks on now. I wouldn't have to say anything. I could have programmed you weeks ago to listen to me. I could have just strided in to bask in the glory of my divine status. Unfortunately, I'm too poor to do that. One can see such a notion of consecrated thought as in a familial relation to christening philosophy. In christening, there is the taking up of a new beginning, a living, mysterious given into the milieu of time and being sent on its mission in life. There is a being given to be or coming to be at all. Given to be, there's also a becoming and a self-becoming. And the later venture of the being is to be consecrated to the giving power, and done so in hope that the endowing power will companion one on the way and receive back the venturing pilgrim at the end. Christening is the giving of a name offered in sacred baptism, affording initiation into a community, enabling the christened one to be newly porous to the reception of sacramental grace. It is a new and renewed life, and indeed a gracing of the new life with new life in a hyperbolic sense. Christening is raising new life to a higher power of divine newness in life. It is not done through our own power, through our own self-determination. There is our being placed again in the primal porosity between the divine and the creature, in a sacred betweening where the pouring of water not only purifies but also offers the life-promising matrix of further life. The waters of christening are not the waters of tohu bohu, nor are they the waters of the flood. They are the chaste tokens of pure flowing, pure porosity, opening, so to say, the formless of the endowed soul, which is enabled to assume all forms, and primarily the deiformity that is prior to deformity and successor to deformity in reformed life. Christening also entails the singularity of the human name, but not as a neutral tag which indifferently singles out the indifferently particular item. There is the sign of singularity in the name, in the naming, which calls the one into the intimacy of the universal God. Christening initiates one into the sacred community as the intimate universal, as I call it. Generally, the practice of philosophy has tended to turn from this to the more abstract universal. I think this is not necessitated, and indeed it is not instantiated in some of the paradigmatic practitioners of thinking. I've talked about this in a book called The Intimate Universal. The singularity of thought is singularized in metaxological community. Perhaps we ought to think more of the idea of the spirit that breathes plurivocally on what is, and the diverse gifts, diverse persons diversely are offered. And yet it is the same spirit in all of the plurality. Given time, I have to leave out some stuff here, but the book that I published recently called God Sends, it raised questions in my mind too about the nature of a godparent. In the liturgy of christening witnesses, the witnesses of the godparents, and how one would map being a godparent onto thought itself. I mean, do we as philosophers actually need godparents? Who could possibly serve as godparents to us philosophers? In the thinking of the church, the godparent is there because of the mortal frailty of life, and the biological parents could die, but a spiritual parent is there to offer nurture and sustenance towards the maturity of the child when needed. But if you were to actually apply that analogy, I have a few thoughts here, but I leave them out here. But it's a very interesting question to ask about the community of philosophers. If they are christened, where would they find godparents among their colleagues? Now go into any philosophy department and ask a question like that, and there would be a lot of people looking for the nearest exit, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm not mistaken, I can tell you that. So some last 2 pages. Does christening heighten the sense of companioning that I discussed at the beginning? Consider, companioning does not allow indifference between the companions. Companioning can be a reconciling power struggling against the temptation to hostility. Companioning is not well expressed in the apartheid of the project of parallel lines. Companioning is not well lived in the struggle for subordination. In companioning, one is made to think literally of friends breaking bread together. Christened, this meal becomes the Eucharist, a festive, sacred meal in which the divine offers and shares itself. Perhaps it is best to think of a kind of agapic companioning, a companioning of surplus generosity that makes a way by making way, by opening up, reopening a porosity that might seem like nothing, for there seems to be nothing there in the porosity as such, but it is rather the field of betweening, the intermedium in which through pass communications, and originally the divine communication whose creative word is the enabling origin of all that is. We clutter the porosity with the idols of our own fixation, and christening dissolves the counterfeit doubles of false gods. It allows the flow of sanctifying grace in the porosity, but mostly we see and feel nothing there. And yet in agapeic companioning, there is the superior one who travels incognito the way, and the name of the saving one does not dawn until the breaking of bread. So to conclude with an image of companioning, I think of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Think of this philosophically, so to say, after the death of God, though now perhaps with something of a post-Christian dismay. What might make us turn around and go back to Jerusalem? Christening philosophy? Can the philosopher see himself or herself? Can I see myself with the disciples fleeing from Jerusalem? After the death of God? More than dismay, rather disarray, disorientation after Calvary, the catastrophe of Calvary. The sky darkens, not once, but now it seems forever, and a cloud of night covers the earth, and under it frightened and violent animals rove. An incognito companion walks the way with one as one flees. The companion is mysteriously well versed in scriptural hermeneutics, astonishing in the power of illumination he brings to the sacred words. We are so absorbed in conversation, scriptural and otherwise, we do not stop and ask in arrested astonishment, who is this one? It is only when we come to rest and to the meal that, arrested in more than astonishment, the moment steals the time to unveil the eternal one companioning one in the breaking of the bread. This is the Eucharistic moment enacted and reenacted, and the refugee companions awake to what they now see. This is a moment of christening, perhaps. The companioning now shimmers with a resurrected astonishment, and the words of interpretation have a new charge, a metanoetic charge. The companion vanishes in being recognized, but the response is not dismay or disarray. The companions hurry back to Jerusalem, the holy city they had deserted. I think of these lines from Hopkins, from the wreck of the Deutschland. And again, that Tom is a Jesuit. I hope he appreciates me bringing Jeremiah Hopkins in here. But when I wrote this out, I said, marvelous poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. And then I took out the word the. I said, wreck of Deutschland. And rogue that I am, I couldn't help thinking of Heidegger. I hope Cyril gets my joke, because no one else obviously does. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. That is deeply embedded in the metaphysics of Heidegger in the 1930s. It's astonishing, but not astonishing in a manner that edifies us philosophically as companions. But these words from the wreck of the Deutschland, let him, he's referring to Christ, let him Easter in us, be a dayspring to the dimness of us. Again, Hopkins is marvelous for turning words into verbs, like the word self becomes selving, a transformation that I have made use of in my own thinking. The disciples return by two. As previously they were sent on mission by two. By two. Betuonum, as I mentioned earlier, the old Anglo-Saxon word reflected, I think, in Dutch, by twee, the word for between. As if companioning Christ, the one who breaks bread with us, has now offered us to be christened to a second power, a hyperbolic degree. The full Pentecostal parousia for the community is to come, but perhaps the disciples remember that there was a Pentecostal moment when Jesus was baptized in the waters of the Jordan. Christ himself christened. The christening of Christ seems odd, and yet is it not companioning raised to the hyperbolic degree? The agapeic generosity of the divine sharing the sacred signs of purgation, not only purgation of the sacred porosity and elevation, but it is also immersion in the waters of the flood and going into the belly of the beast, the Leviathan, and coming up and out again on the banks of the river, on the side of the flow of time, and on the surface of the earth, where space itself is sanctified, and from whence will be harvested bread and wine. And even when we are at sea, we are to behold on the shore the resurrected companion, preparing breakfast for friends at break of day, after a long night of toilsome fishing in the mysterious waters of the infinite sea. Thank you.